Now there was a moment, and I want you to really sit with this, when the Veth Dominion looked at a pale blue dot hanging in the void, pointed at it with one of their 6 ceremonial fingers, and said, "Do what we say, or we burn that." They meant it as leverage. They meant it as a power move, the kind of galactic intimidation tactic that had worked on 43 other civilizations before humanity had even figured out how fire worked. The Veth were old. They were calculating. They had dissolved empires with less effort than it takes you to make a cup of morning tea. What they were not, it turns out, was smart enough to understand what they had just done. Let me back up. The Galactic Concord. Think of it as a very old, very bureaucratic interstellar United Nations but with better architecture and worse decision-making, had been in diplomatic negotiations with humanity for about 11 of your Earth years. 11 years of forms, protocols, seating arrangements argued over for 3 months at a time. Translation matrices being recalibrated every other week because human languages kept evolving mid-conversation and nobody had warned anyone that would happen. The Veth representative, a being called Sorvathine, had personally filed 217 formal complaints about human delegates bringing food into the negotiation hall. 217, he counted. He had staff who counted for him. The human lead negotiator at the time was a woman named Priya Vasanthakumar. Sharp, unhurried, with a manner so calm it made other species visibly uncomfortable, like they were always waiting for something to explode. She had represented humanity through every stage of those 11 years, and had, by all Concord accounts, been patient to a degree that frankly unsettled people. The Veth had stalled proceedings 14 times. She smiled through all 14. She rescheduled. She brought better snacks to the next session. It was unnerving. The Veth Dominion was not interested in peace, of course. They never had been. They wanted access. Specifically, access to the transit corridor humanity now controlled near the Kelfara Expanse, a stretch of navigable space that cut 4 months off any route between the Veth's eastern territories and their primary fuel extraction operations. They had tried to acquire it through purchase. Priya had declined. They had tried political maneuvering through the Concord. Priya had countered with procedural motions so dense that Sorvathine's legal team needed 6 weeks just to read them. They had tried subtle economic pressure. Priya had, and I want you to appreciate this, looked them in the eye and simply waited. So the Veth escalated. On the 431st day of what was formally called the Kelfara Corridor Dialogue, a name that had always been generous, Sorvathine arrived with a retinue twice the usual size, in formal military diplomatic attire, with 2 Veth warships repositioned into observable range of Earth's outer monitoring systems. He sat down across from Priya with the kind of settled confidence that comes from 600 years of getting what you want. He laid a data slate on the table. On the slate was a targeting analysis. Earth, its orbital infrastructure, its population centers, the projected timeline from first strike to, as the Veth documentation put it, cessation of meaningful resistance. The Dominion, Sorvathine said, through the translation matrix in a voice like grinding stone, has grown tired of dialogue. You will grant transit rights, full and unrestricted, within 72 of your planetary hours, or the negotiation becomes academic. He said academic the way you might say irrelevant. The way you say a word when you want someone to feel small. Priya looked at the slate for a long moment. Then she looked at Sorvathine. Then, and this is the part that every Concord observer in that room would describe differently depending on which species they were, because they all saw something different in her face. She folded her hands on the table. I see, she said. Just that. I see. No raised voice. No visible alarm. She asked for a recess of 30 minutes, which the Concord mediator, a soft-spoken Tellurian named Obaski Fen, granted with the expression of someone watching a disaster in slow motion. In those 30 minutes, 3 things happened. Priya sent 1 message. 1. To a contact listed in her files simply as Coordinator Harlan. The message was 4 words. It said, Slate 7. They did. Harlan Volkov was not technically a diplomat. His official Concord registered title was Human Strategic Continuity Advisor. which is the kind of job title that sounds boring until you find out what it actually means. He was based not on Earth, not in the Concorde's central stations, but aboard a mid-sized vessel called the Unbroken Argument, which, if you know anything about how humans name their ships, tells you something about the crew's general personality. Currently positioned at a location that was not in any public registry, Harlan read the message. He set down whatever he had been eating. Witnesses say it was something called a biscuit, which, remarkably, became a minor footnote in Concorde historical records. He stood. He walked to the command deck. He said, to no one in particular, "All right then." The second thing that happened in those 30 minutes was that 41 other human vessels, scattered across 6 different star systems, received an automated signal that Priya's message had triggered. These were not warships exactly. The Concorde had strict rules about warships. Humanity had spent a decade learning exactly what those rules said, and exactly what they did not say. The third thing that happened was that Sorvathane's military attaché received a quiet, confused report from the 2 Veth warships near Earth. Their targeting systems were experiencing interference. Not jamming. Jamming was aggressive, detectable, a violation of Concorde Treaty. This was something quieter. Their systems simply kept returning navigational data that did not match their sensor readings, as if the ships could not quite locate themselves with confidence. It would later be described by Veth engineers as environmental noise. It would later be understood by people with more context as a very polite message. The recess ended. Priya returned to the table. Sorvathane had not moved. He had the patience of geological formations. It was one of the things his species was genuinely proud of. "We've considered your proposal," Priya said. "Your answer?" Sorvathane replied. "No," she said. There was a silence in that room that several observers later described as the silence before something tears. Sorvathane's secondary eyes, the ones Veth used for close threat assessment, narrowed. "You understand what you are declining," he said. "We do," she said. "You are declining the survival of your world." Priya tilted her head, very slightly, in the way that some humans do when they find something mildly interesting. "I think you may have misunderstood the situation," she said. Sorvathane was not accustomed to being told he had misunderstood things. It had genuinely not occurred to him as a possibility. He had 600 years of successful coercive diplomacy behind him. He had a targeting slate on the table. He had warships in position. "Explain," he said, because he was in his own way curious. Priya did not answer immediately. Instead, she pressed a small control on her side of the table, a request to the room's shared display systems, which Obeisky Fen approved with the look of someone who was not entirely sure he should. The main display in the chamber activated. It showed a map, not of Earth, not of human space as the Concorde formally recognized it. A different map, larger, with more detail than anyone present had expected, showing traffic corridors, supply lines, resource extraction points, communication relay positions, and overlaid on that map, in quiet, unhurried markers, were 41 positions. Ships, human ships. Sorvathane studied the map for a long time. His legal team studied it. His military attaché studied it. And then, almost imperceptibly, went very still. The positions were not random. Each one sat along a critical line in Veth Dominion logistics. Supply routes, fuel corridors, the communication relays that connected the Dominion's eastern territories to its core systems. The extraction operations they were so desperate to reach through the Kelthara corridor. Every pressure point, every dependency, every load-bearing structure in the Veth's interstellar economy. There was a human ship near it. Not blocking it, not threatening it, just near it. Present, waiting. "We have been in the Concorde for 11 years, Priya said, in a tone that was almost conversational. "We are slow learners, some people say. We spent most of that time doing paperwork, filing motions, learning procedure. We also spent it learning geography." Sorvathane's face and Veth faces were not expressive by most species standards, did something that Obeisky Fen, who had seen a lot of diplomatic moments, would later describe only as a recalibration. "Those vessels are in neutral corridors," Sorvathane said finally. They are not in violation of any treaty. No, Priya agreed pleasantly. They're not. They are not armed for engagement. Not in any way the treaty defines, she agreed again. This is, Sorvathine said, slowly, a threat. Priya looked at him for a moment with an expression that was not unkind exactly but was very direct. You put a targeting slate for my planet on the table, she said. We responded with a map. I think we're both being honest about where we stand. Another silence. This one had a different texture. The first silence had been the kind that precedes escalation. This one was the kind that precedes reconsideration. The Dominion's position, Sorvathine said, in a voice that had lost some of its geological certainty, was a negotiating posture. Of course it was, Priya said. We did not intend literal. Of course not, she said, still pleasantly. He looked at the map for a long moment. Then at Priya, he was, whatever else could be said about him, perceptive enough to understand what he was looking at. Not the map, but the human sitting across from him. 11 years of patience. 11 years of forms and rescheduling and snacks brought to the next session. Not waiting for the negotiations to succeed. Waiting with extraordinary calm for this moment. For someone to make exactly the mistake he had just made. You anticipated this, he said. We hoped it wouldn't be necessary, she said. That was the end of part 1. No, I'm joking. That was the end of day 1. Because here's the thing about threatening humanity's home and then discovering the people who live there have been quietly mapping every weakness you have for 11 years while smiling politely about the seating arrangements. The conversation isn't over. It just changes character, dramatically. And Sorvathine, to his very limited credit, understood that he had not lost yet. He had stumbled. He had revealed his hand early, but the Veth Dominion had not survived 6 centuries of interstellar politics by folding at the first sign of unexpected resistance. He straightened his ceremonial collar. He looked at Priya Vasantakumar with the kind of reassessed respect that powerful beings only give when they have no choice. Perhaps, he said carefully, we should discuss the corridor terms again. Priya smiled. It was not a warm smile, exactly. But it was a very human one. The problem with that smile, and I say this as someone who has observed 47 spacefaring civilizations do their worst to each other, was that it did not mean what Sorvathine thought it meant. He thought it meant she was pleased, that she had won the moment, felt the satisfaction of it, and was now ready to negotiate from a position of comfort. That is what the smile would have meant on a Veth face. A settling, a relaxing of tension, an invitation to find middle ground now that the posturing was finished. What it actually meant, as 3 human observers in that room could have told him and didn't, was that Priya Vasantakumar had just shifted from one mode entirely into another. The patience was done. The waiting was done. 11 years of careful, deliberate, almost meditative restraint had just completed its purpose, and what was sitting across from Sorvathine now was something considerably more direct. He was about to find out what humans are like when they stop being patient. Obaseki Fen, the Tellurian mediator, had been running Concord proceedings for 32 years. He had a gift for reading rooms that his colleagues called supernatural, and he called experience. He read this room now, looked between Priya and Sorvathine, and made a quiet decision to let events proceed without his intervention. Some negotiations, he had learned, needed a mediator. Some needed a witness. He folded his hands and became a witness. Priya slid the Veth targeting slate back across the table to Sorvathine. She did it gently, without drama, the way you return something that was never really a threat to begin with. Before we discuss the corridor, she said, I want to establish something clearly, not as a negotiating point, as a fact. Can I do that? Sorvathine, who was still recalibrating, nodded. The Dominion has used this tactic before, she said. 43 times by our count. 43 civilizations were shown a version of what you showed me today. Most of them had something they loved that could be targeted. Most of them gave you what you wanted. We spent a considerable amount of time studying those cases. Your point, Sorvathine said. In 31 of those cases, Priya continued, as if she hadn't been interrupted. The concession was the beginning of a longer extraction process. Transit rights became resource rights. Resource rights became administrative oversight. Administrative oversight became something that stopped looking like diplomacy after about 20 years. She paused. We read the documentation, all of it, 43 cases, 31 of them ended the same way. Sorvathine's secondary eyes were very still. Those are Dominion internal records, he said, quietly. They were, she agreed. The military attaché seated behind Sorvathine made a sound. Not quite a word, more the involuntary noise of someone who has just understood something and wishes they hadn't. Sorvathine did not turn around. He kept his eyes on Priya with the fixed attention of a being doing very rapid internal mathematics. How long? He asked. Since year 3, she said. Year 3. 8 years ago. 8 years of access to Veth internal documentation, and humanity had spent those 8 years saying nothing, filing procedural motions, complaining about translation matrix calibration, and learning exactly precisely, surgically, where every pressure point in the Dominion's operational structure was located. The map on the display was still visible. Sorvathine looked at it again, really looked at it this time, with the understanding of someone who now knew that the positions shown were not chosen randomly or generally, but with specific, detailed internal knowledge of Veth dependency chains. Each of those 41 ships was not just near a critical point. It was at the critical point, the exact one, like someone had been handed the schematic and circled every load-bearing component, which of course someone had. What do you want? Sorvathine asked. And there it was. 600 years of Veth diplomatic experience, distilled down to 4 words, because sometimes that is where you end up. Priya picked up her own data slate. Not the Veth one, her own, and placed it on the table facing him. The corridor, she said, remains under human administration. Full stop. No negotiation on that point. Veth commercial traffic will be granted access under a published schedule and a fee structure that Concord economists have assessed as fair. Obaseki has those numbers. You can verify them. In exchange, humanity will support Dominion membership elevation at the next Concord session, which, as you know, would give you a permanent seat on the resource mediation panel you've been trying to get for 40 years. Sorvathine was quiet. That seat, Priya added, is worth considerably more to your eastern expansion plans than the transit time you'd save through our corridor. We ran the numbers. Your own internal projections say the same thing, as it turns out. Another silence. This one was almost thoughtful. You are offering us something we want, Sorvathine said slowly, in exchange for giving up the leverage we came here with. I'm offering you something you want, Priya said, instead of what you came here thinking you wanted. There's a difference. Sorvathine's legal team was huddled. His military attaché was very quietly sending messages to someone. Harlan Volkov's team would later confirm they tracked 6 outgoing communications in that moment, all of them to Veth Dominion Command, all of them carrying the same basic content, which translated roughly as, "We may have a situation." The Dominion Command's response came back in under 4 minutes, which, for an institution that had once debated a seating arrangement for 3 months, was essentially instantaneous. That speed told its own story. Sorvathine read the response. He set the communication device down with the careful precision of someone who has decided to be very controlled about how they move for the next few minutes. The Dominion, he said, requires 48 hours to formally assess the proposal. Of course, Priya said. The warships near your monitoring systems will be repositioned during that time. As a gesture, appreciated, Priya said. The session ended. People filed out. Obaseki Fen remained in his seat for a moment longer than necessary, looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man updating his understanding of several things simultaneously. Then he gathered his notes, stood and walked out. In the corridor outside, he found Priya checking messages on her personal device, with the focused calm of someone catching up on administrative tasks. He stopped beside her. 43 cases, he said. Year 3. She said, not looking up. I have been mediating for 32 years. He said. I want you to understand I am saying this sincerely. I did not see that coming. Priya looked up then. There was something in her expression that was not quite amusement, but was adjacent to it, the look of someone who has maintained a very long performance and is now, briefly, off stage. "We're slow learners," she said. "You said so yourself." Obeski Fen made a sound that in Tellurian functioned as a laugh. "I have never said that," he said. "Someone did," she said. "It's in the session records." He looked at her for a moment longer. "The 41 ships," he said. "Are they still in position?" "Until the agreement is signed," she said. "And after?" "After," she said, "they go back to doing whatever they were doing before." Which was, she looked at him with a perfectly even expression. Paperwork, mostly. He did not entirely believe that. But he decided, did not need to push it. The 48 hours passed. Harlan Volkov spent them on the unbroken argument, eating additional biscuits, and having long conversations with a woman named Tovi Sundquist, who was the vessel's chief systems coordinator and had been responsible for the navigational interference experienced by the Veth warships near Earth. Tovi had opinions about how the interference had been implemented. Specifically, she felt it had been too subtle, that a slightly less subtle version would have communicated the point more efficiently. Harlan disagreed. They argued about this for most of the 48 hours. It was, by their standards, a relaxed and pleasant wait. On the Veth side of things, the 48 hours were somewhat less relaxed. Sorvathine filed 6 internal reports, had 4 meetings with his command council via encrypted relay, and spent a considerable amount of time looking at the map Priya had displayed, a copy of which his team had recorded, and tracing the positions of those 41 ships against his own knowledge of Dominion infrastructure. Every time he finished the exercise, he arrived at the same conclusion. Then he started again, hoping to arrive at a different one. He never did. The Dominion Command Council was furious. Which was understandable. They were furious in the specific way that very powerful institutions become furious when they discover that someone has been doing homework. Not just good homework, but patient, thorough, years-long homework conducted with a smile and a willingness to reschedule. It was an unfamiliar feeling. They did not enjoy it, but they were also, underneath the fury, practical. The resource mediation panel seat was real. Priya's assessment of its value was accurate, irritatingly accurate, sourced as it was from their own internal projections. And the alternative to accepting the proposal was not, it turned out, the comfortable leverage position they had walked into the negotiation hall with. The alternative was 41 ships staying exactly where they were, indefinitely, while the Concord watched and the Dominion tried to explain why it had threatened a member civilization's home planet and was now declining a reasonable counteroffer. The Veth had spent 6 centuries building a reputation in the Concord. It was not a warm reputation, but it was a functional one. This situation, if it became a full Concord matter, would not add to it. Sorvathine returned to the negotiation hall on the 47th hour. He sat. He folded his hands on the table in a posture that his species used to indicate prepared acceptance, a gesture so formal that Obaseki Fen raised both his eyebrows and then carefully lowered them again before anyone noticed. Priya sat across from him. She had brought tea. She had, characteristically, brought enough for everyone at the table. Sorvathine looked at the tea for a moment. "You brought refreshments to every session," he said. "It seems polite," she said. "For 11 years, he said. The sessions were long," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, and this was noted by every observer in the room, and written into 3 separate Concord historical logs, he reached out and accepted a cup. It was a very small gesture. It was also in Veth diplomatic language, a specific one. A signal that had not been used in formal proceedings since a boundary treaty 200 years ago. It meant roughly that the party offering terms was being recognized as a peer rather than an obstacle. Priya accepted this without comment. She poured her own tea. She waited. "The Dominion accepts the framework," Sorvathine said. "The corridor terms as outlined. The fee structure pending Concord economic verification. The membership elevation in exchange for commercial access under your published schedule." "We accept the Dominion's acceptance," Priya said, "because that is also a formal thing you have to say." And she had learned all the formal things. The documents were signed over the next 6 hours. Obaseki Fen processed them with an efficiency that suggested he had been preparing for this outcome longer than he would officially admit. Harlan Volkov received a single message, also 4 words, that said, "Slate 7, it's done." He read it, finished his biscuit, and told Tove Sundquist to bring the unbroken argument home. Tove said she still thought the interference had been too subtle. Harlan said the point had landed fine. Tove said landing fine wasn't the same as landing well. They argued about this for another 2 hours on the way back. Here is what the Veth Dominion issued publicly, 2 weeks after the agreement was signed. A formal statement to the Concord describing the outcome as a productive and mutually beneficial resolution to a long-standing navigational rights discussion. It emphasized the Dominion's commitment to collaborative interstellar frameworks. It mentioned briefly the Resource Mediation Panel seat, framed as a recognition of Veth contributions to galactic stability. It did not mention the targeting slate. It did not mention the 41 ships. It did not mention Year 3. Or 8 years of internal documents, or navigational interference, or biscuits, or Priya Vasanthakumar's 11 years of patient, unhurried, absolutely lethal preparation. Here is what 42 other civilizations did. In the months that followed, when they heard the story through channels that were not the official Concord record, because these things always travel, through diplomatic backchannels and trade route conversations and the kind of careful, quiet information sharing that spacefaring species do when something important happens. They updated their assessments of humanity, not the military assessments. Those had already been revised several times by various parties. The other assessments, the ones about patience, about methodology, about what it meant that a species had spent 11 years in a room with people who underestimated them, and had simply waited and learned and prepared and smiled and brought enough tea for everyone. Some of them found it reassuring. Some of them found it, frankly, terrifying. Sorvathine, for his part, filed one final private note into the Dominion's internal records before closing the Kalthara file. It was not a long note. It said, in Veth administrative language, that the human delegation had at no point been what the Dominion's initial analysis suggested, that the error had been categorical rather than tactical, and that future engagements with human representatives should begin from the assumption that whatever you could see was not the whole picture. He thought about adding something more specific. He decided against it. Some lessons, he wrote instead, are simply expensive. He closed the file. He did not reopen it, and somewhere in a mid-sized vessel called the Unbroken Argument, crossing an unremarkable stretch of space between a corridor that was now, formally and permanently, human-administered, Tove Sundquist finally conceded, after 3 days of argument, that the interference had probably been subtle enough. Harlan Volkov did not say "I told you so." He did smile, though, very quietly, very patiently.